Welcome to the Emerging Biotech Leader, where we help biotech leaders maximize the value of their therapeutics from translational development to product launch. We're your hosts. I'm Kim Kushner.
And I'm Ramin. We are here to help you navigate the pitfalls of the biotech industry and illuminate the path forward.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Emerging Biotech Leader podcast. I'm here today sitting in for Kim Kushner again. It's awesome to be back on the podcast with my colleague Ramin, who is our steadfast leader consistently on the podcast. We have another colleague of ours joining us today, Jacqui Levine, who has also been with the firm for quite some time. So we're so happy to have you, Jacqui.
Thank you. It's nice to be here.
Yeah, awesome. So today we're going to recap on an episode that we previously hosted, where we talked a lot about launch strategies in the context of biotech and kind of small pharma. And we reflected a lot on how it's very different when you're approaching a launch, when you're in these smaller organizations where the resourcing can be really different, leadership is very different, teams have different levels of experience. And I think what we really took away from that it does require some very specific skills, communication styles, and you have to take a really different strategy when you're approaching that launch. So to kick us off, I'd love to hear from Ramin and Jacqui, who I know you guys have been involved with a couple different launches in both small and large pharma, about what are some of the things that stand out to you that differentiate a launch in a small biotech versus what we see in large pharma today.
Great. Thanks, Adriana. One of the things that's really different, in biotech versus a big pharma is the availability of resources, right? So there's a number of different constraints that they have. And when you look at that, you really need to take a risk-based approach. You can't do everything all at once. So thinking strategically, planning, through the life cycle of what would be needed, as well as being able to account for some of the ups and downs, right? It's not always a smooth sailing, straight line path. So being able to address those different, inflection points, being able to, resource accordingly, flex in, flex out, but really focus on what are the most important priorities and make sure you're addressing those, the must-haves versus the nice-to-haves.
Ramin, you must have a great perspective on this, coming from larger pharma and then transitioning into small pharma of late.
Yeah, for sure. No, I agree with you, Jacqui. I mean, first of all, I think that launching a product is the most exciting part of being in the pharma. Everything is fresh. You bring in a new product to the market and bring a new product to the patients. There's a lot of excitement internally, cross-functionally, within medical affairs, within clinical, within commercial. So that's really a piece that I really enjoy in launching a product. It is very multidimensional, right? It's not just one focus, and it's definitely not a straight line. I think one thing that I noticed in the smaller biotech companies bringing a product, with regards to the resources, you really have to be hyper-focused on your execution plan, and you have to sequence them, right? You don't have the resource that a larger pharma will have to put in, like maybe 10, 20, 30 people behind a launch of product, or millions and millions of dollars. So you have to be really agile within your organization, making sure that you focus on key areas that are incredibly important to execute flawlessly, right? And then build on that, and the next thing and the next thing. One thing that I've learned that is probably, at least for me, it's been my experience, has been the core of a launch is the communication platform. What are we going to say about our product? What is our compelling clinical story? And who are we going to say that to? Because that story perhaps will change a little bit depending on your audience. If you're talking to the investors, you're talking to the patients, you're talking to the KOLs or clinicians, and what you may have. So that's a piece. I think that's the core. If you get that right off the gate, which also forces the organization to have cross-functional alignment with your clinical colleagues, with regulatory, with commercial, perhaps even in smaller companies with the CEO and the C-suite within the company. From there on, things are a little bit easier. Not necessarily that it's going to be a smooth sailing, but for sure that's one piece that it takes a lot of effort and energy to make sure that you get it right.
Yeah, and it makes me think that even though we say, in small pharma, biotech, they're lean, and they have maybe less resources or smaller teams, there's still this need for hyper coordination and communication, as you suggested. So you can't lose those principles just because you're small and you feel like a leaner team doesn't need all that infrastructure, but it is still very critical. And, we see oftentimes with clients that they're used to operating with individualized functions that are very productive, but when you get them all together, it can be very challenging to keep them coordinated and aligned to kind of the end goal and the end game, which is that launch. And so it's really about, creating many more communication channels and pathways so that you're facilitating like a very symbiotic team with clear objectives and plans. And I'd be curious to hear a little bit more about this risk-based approach and some of the things that we're hearing that clients are really focused on. In the last episode, we did mention like having that patient in mind, and that patient and the customer at the end. Like that means that we need to be, really thinking about patient advocacy. How are we talking about this amongst those groups? How are we talking about it amongst HCPs and other stakeholders? So would love to get your perspective on kind of how those other stakeholders need to be prioritized as a part of a launch approach.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think some of that also depends on, is it a rare disease? Is it going more mass market? And like, what are the nuances of it? Because it is going to be different depending on the scenario. But, regardless, making sure, that the patient is the forefront of why we're all doing this, right? So that is critically important. But making sure that there is that coordination on the ground, that the folks that need to be aware are aware, that there's the support and the training, the medical, messages are coming across, and that there is that alignment, both internally and externally, so that you can have that focus.
No, I have the same experience. I think that the two main groups that you want to focus on, one is the patient advocacy groups and the patients, and the other one definitely your KOLs, right? And as I mentioned earlier, you can't have what I call a shotgun approach, that you try to go after everybody with the same equal, especially in biotech. Big pharma, they have more resources. Also in big pharma, even the resources in big pharma is still limited. It's not like it's unlimited, right? But at least for biotech, staying really, really close, having your ears to the ground of what the advocacy groups are saying, what's most important to the patients, what's really their unmet need, right? And doing the same thing with your thought leaders. It's incredibly important, not just because you're listening to them, just for the fact that you want to listen and building relationship. It really goes way, way beyond that. You want to make sure that you translate those findings, those insights from them, and bring it back to the organization, bring back to the company, making sure that you're designing your clinical trials in a way that it will be meaningful to the patients, it will be meaningful to the clinicians and the treaters. And that's just one key aspect of it. I think if you focus on those two groups and being able to kind of be that almost a facilitator between the two, right? And bringing that to the organization, and you keep an open mind that maybe if you had a certain way that you were going to do your study, or you had a certain way that you were going to bring your product to the market, you're going to have to keep an open mind that, well, that may not be the best way, especially in ultra rare disease and rare disease. You want to really stay close to the patients and your thought leaders. They almost become your advocate. They become part of your team. You have to partner with them. Is way beyond just building a relationship, because they're in it for a long time, and so should you be in it for the long time with them.
I also think it brings a point of, what can you do yourself internally, and what do you need to rely on partners to do, right? Is you might not be able to do it all yourself, particularly in a resource, constrained, very fast moving environment. So looking for the right partners that are, aligned with your strategic goals, that can, move very quickly, can flex in, can flex out, and really help you achieve the results you're looking to achieve is really critical.
Yeah. What I'm hearing from both of you is like how launch planning can be so iterative almost, that you need to be absorbing information from the field. You need to be, assessing your launch plan. Do I need to bring in different partners? Do I need to bring different skill sets to bear at a certain period of time to effectuate a certain amount of change or build momentum around an area? So it does sort of make you think. It's sort of a bit of a moving target to an extent, and it, how agile you really need to be as a leader in that type of environment. You can't just rest on specific principles or ways of working that you might have had in a kind of in a in a more resourced organization, or just an organization with much more skill sets to bear. So I'd love to talk and transition the conversation a little bit to some of the skill sets that you feel like leaders, specifically in launch, are really gravitating towards and really need to have to help accelerate and keep the train moving for a launch.
I think there's a number of different things that are really important. One is to be able to think strategically, but also translate that into execution. And there's a number of different components of that. Ramin, I think you hit on it earlier in our conversation, which was cross-functional alignment and communication. So tying that all together, making sure that as you're moving forward, that everyone's moving with you and there's an appropriate amount of transparency to make sure that the team and the external stakeholders and whoever else needs to be in the loop is. And along the way, if there are setbacks that you experience, how you manage through them, that you keep the teams engaged, you keep the other investors or other stakeholders engaged as you go through this journey. So I think those are a couple of things that are really important. And then also just being flexible, being agile, being able to move quickly as things will evolve, and you have to be prepared for almost a variety of scenarios and situations as they come about.
Right. No, absolutely. I think one of the most important thing, and there's so many, everything is so multidimensional, right? Especially in small biotech, because you have to be really good at so many different things, right? And not just you personally, but also the team itself as well. And one of the things that comes to my mind is that you got to be a broad thinker. You got to think across your enterprise. You cannot just think about your own function. Right? You need to be an expert in your own function, without a doubt. That's a requirement. But you also got to think about the entire company. And I think that sometimes becomes a little bit challenging, and a skill set that you may not have the chance to develop if you come from a big pharma, because big pharma has the experts in their own functions, and that's how they operate. And it really makes sense. But when you come to a smaller biotech company or a startup, you want to make sure that you're thinking across the enterprise. You're thinking about with your colleagues in regulatory, clinical, medical, commercial, CMC, and all the different aspects. And you want to have that. You want that to be something that you're interested in, and you are genuinely want to learn about, in order to provide also your input and feedback. I think that's one of the core that is really important. The other skill set, and this is regardless of the company or the size, is the communication. I think the communication skills internally, externally, we already talked about how critical that is, but internally is probably even more critical. You have to be able to communicate your point, keep an open mind when people have feedback, that you can kind of listen to it and see if this is something that you can make your idea even better, or maybe you have to push back and educate your colleagues that this is the way that you need to be taught about. And this also all the way up goes to the board too, because in the smaller companies, you have a lot of opportunities to be in front of the board of directors, not necessarily in a bigger pharma. And the board is part of your team. It's not board sitting on their own island. They're really hands-on, and they're really participating with the rest of the organization. So how you communicate with them, and I know a lot of us have been invited to present to the board. What a slide deck do you take? What's important to them? What do you focus on? What points you bring up? It's really, really important. And I know, Adriana, you work with a lot of the clients that they have to present to the board, and I know it's a haunting task sometimes, and it's very nerve-wracking and not something easy to do. How do you deal with that? How do you coach and work with some of the clients?
Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting when we were preparing for a previous episode, one of the folks we interviewed talked a lot about how a big focus of her is obviously she's built competencies developing and presenting to boards. She knows exactly, we need to focus on 2 to 3 slides, main points, direct, clear. But the things she's been working on the most lately is actually building up her teams to be ready for those types of discussions, because these are board members that are walking the halls, that are talking to team members, that are obviously very savvy business leaders, but they want to hear it from the teams. And that's something that is very, very different in biotech than it is in other, even I would say other industries, where boards are high in the sky and they are completely removed from functional leads at best. So when I'm working with clients, I'm always thinking about, obviously who is my audience, this board member, what do they want to hear? But also, what can I do to elevate the person who's presenting this and showing that strategic point of view, but also not getting them in the weeds. And I think that that's something that a lot of our leaders struggle with is, wanting to explain something in the most amount of detail that they possibly can, because they think that that's the way to understand it. And when you're thinking about a launch, it's so intricate and it's so complex, and there's so many different stakeholders. And even to the point you were making, Ramin, like, what's the difference between speaking to a KOL versus speaking to a PI versus speaking to an emerging leader in the field? And do we need to explain that to our board? Probably not. We need to explain to them, these are the key messages. This is where we want to impact. This is who we want to influence. So always trying to elevate the message, but also elevating your team members as much as you can around that, and giving them the experiences if you can, of course. And I think that from the other folks we've spoken to, they're very much focused on, especially in the biotech field, it's something that we hear all the time is like, how do we build skills amongst the folks we have around us? Because they're going to be rising up. And we want to make sure they're ready and they're equipped, because this is expected. It's very much expected when you're in these organizations to be ready and able to present to boards, unlike I've seen in other industries. So it's certainly nerve-wracking. We've probably interviewed a bunch of people who have only presented to a few boards, like a handful maybe, and it's definitely. It's a different leadership skill set. You have to be able to elevate the message, certainly.
For sure. And you have to be ready for unexpected, right? Because you have no idea what the board is going to ask of you when you're in the front, and you got like 15 eyes on you, not just the board members. Also, you got the CEO, you got the CFO. So the room is very, great minds of the company that are actually in the room. One thing I remembered was, as you were describing, the first time I presented to a board, I had maybe 6 minutes or 7 minutes. Your presentation comes down to the minutes, not like maybe 15 or 20, right? And I must have done maybe a dozen, or if not more, rehearsal and prepping for that 7 or 8 minutes, making sure that every word that comes out of my mouth, it's something not necessarily rehearsed, because you're trying to tell them something that they just need. Remember, your board members are not all familiar with whatever topic that you're talking to, right? Whether it's a scientific topic or whether it's focusing on the commercial or whatever the case may be, you really want to make sure that you also have an opportunity to educate them sometimes on a certain topic with them, but you have a very limited number of the time. So preparation is probably the best solution, and over preparing for board meetings, and making sure your slides are also very, very in sync and crystal clear, without talking about a lot of different things that they may not even be interested in.
Yeah, and I think that I think we've mentioned it on this episode already, but the stakes are never higher than when you're launching a product, and the board is going to ask really the tough questions to make sure you are capitalizing on this moment, that you are making all the right moves. So it's so important to elevate that message and deliver it with clarity. But you have to have done your homework, and you have to have, done the planning, done the critical thinking to have the right launch approach depending on what your asset is, what your market is, and who your customer is. So I think it's always, and I'd be curious to get your perspective on, it's always important to me to make sure that when I'm working with clients is like making sure we have an aligned launch team, that everyone is working towards the same goal. And Jacqui, I know you're working on a launch currently, and maybe you have some reflections on what makes these launch teams successful, and what are some of the things that you try to instill to get that team, energized around a specific launch goal.
Yeah, that's a great question. And as you were talking about the messaging for the board, it's a clinical development organization is very different than a post-marketing organization, right? And making that transition, there's a lot of different skills, a lot of different capabilities, infrastructure that is needed. So to your point, having a really well thought out integrated launch plan across the different functions, making sure that people are aware of the different interdependencies and connectivity points is really, really critical. And I think, we've touched upon some of the other points with, communication and alignment, but I think really understanding what's required for launch and how that's different from being a clinical development organization is really critical, because there's an opportunity to miss things or have some missteps, and you don't want that. So all the pre-planning, again, is, we talked about taking an approach that is, focused on the most critical elements, but knowing what that plan is and making sure that if there are any gaps that need to be filled, that you have a plan to fill them.
Yeah, there's definitely so many infrastructure changes that need to happen when you make that transition from a research focused organization to a post-marketing organization. And I do think that sometimes that does get lost. People are so focused on getting that launch ready. And I think I try to emphasize with clients that, you almost have to bake that in as part of your launch plan. You have to make sure your organization is ready to meet the demands of a post-marketing world, because that really puts your launch at risk if you don't have the appropriate infrastructure in place and compliant infrastructure. So it's, of course, like you're gearing up towards getting a product to market, but you also have to have an organization that's ready, should it, when it's there and it can operate at that optimized level to the expectations of health authorities and others, because they will have different expectations, and that could jeopardize your launch if you're not ready, from many different lenses, PV, medical affairs, and obviously commercial payers, et cetera. Anything to add on that, Ramin? You look like you were going to jump in.
This is so true what you're saying. I think sometimes we confuse launching date and approval date. Right, approval date when the product becomes available, obviously for the patients. But the launch of a product starts many, many months, if not a couple of years before that, right? So you have to have that mindset, right, and not confuse the two, right? And it's really easier, I think, especially, I've seen this in a big pharma or a small pharma, that we think about launch date is the date that the product is approved. So we always think, we have time to do this, or we can do this later, or this is right. So it's not like that we're trying to procrastinate. There's just so many different things going on, right? That they just kind of get pushed out. And then all of a sudden you see there's only 4 months to go or 6 months to go and before your approval date. And there's a lot of things that you haven't had a chance to think about, which is the point that both of you brought up, that you really need to be forward thinker, right? You need to think about, 6 months to a year ahead, that what it is that you're going to need even post-launch, right? After your approval date, whether it's the evidence generation that you need to start thinking about and what that plan would be. What are the unmet data that you still need to have, for example, when you do come to the market, that your clinical study perhaps did not had a chance, or it wasn't designed to kind of provide, right? So you definitely want to think about beyond that, right? And sometimes that gets a little bit challenging. That's why I think it's really important to be sequential. You don't have to have all the bells and whistles to be extremely successful in your launch, right? You just need to be strategic, think across the organization, and also execute seamlessly on the areas that are your priority. And if you focus on those, I think you have a much better chance for launching the product in a successful way.
Yeah. What I'm hearing is that the work doesn't end once you launch a product is what I think you're saying, Ramin.
It's so exciting, and it's definitely one of my passions in this area is launching a product, bringing it to the market.
Yeah. Yeah. And it really is sort of like leading into really that life cycle management, and making sure that you keep thinking about the product. And as you said earlier, getting feedback from the field, to augment evidence, to continuously inform stakeholders internally and externally about the relevance of the product, whether it be, through new data, real world evidence, et cetera. I think that those are some of the things that some of very forward leaning sponsors think about as even a part of their, launch approach. What is that step even further? Well, this has been an awesome conversation about launching in biotech. Thanks so much again, Jacqui, for joining us. Always a pleasure. And thank you again to Ramin, our steadfast leader. Really appreciate everyone listening in. Hope you have a great afternoon.
Thank you both.
Thank you.
Thanks for tuning in to the Emerging Biotech Leader, an SSI Strategy podcast. Join us each month for more conversations with biotech leaders. If you'd like to help navigating the complexities of biotech, reach out to our team at ssistrategy.com. Don't forget to hit subscribe and leave a review.